Good evening, residents of Everett, Washington. I'd like to call to order the Everett City Council meeting of August 17th, 2022, and welcome everyone back into the City Council chambers. The City Council is conducting our weekly council meeting hybrid. This will allow us to reach members of our community who wish to participate via Zoom and those who wish to attend in person in the chambers. It is our hope to continue this format to be as accessible as possible to our community. For those who wish to participate via Zoom at a future meeting, you will find the public comment registration form on the City of Everett website under the City Council Department. Click on the link that says register here to provide comment via Zoom. Fill out the form completely, and once your form is submitted, you'll receive an email confirmation with the Zoom link and the phone number to the meeting. Participants must submit this form at least 30 minutes prior to the meeting. Forms submitted after that time will not receive the Zoom link and phone number to speak, but may still participate the day of the meeting by coming in person to the council chambers. Please note we do not allow comments on any kind of campaigning, whether for or against ballot measures or candidates running for office. We also do not accept comments focused on personal matters that are unrelated to city business. Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Mayor Franklin.
Here.
Councilmember Fossey. Here. Councilmember Zarlingo.
Here.
Councilmember Vogely. Here. Councilmember Schwab.
Excused?
Councilmember Toohey.
Here.
Councilmember Ryan.
Here.
President Stonecipher.
Here. I'd like to ask Vice President Toohey to lead the Pledge of Allegiance.
Yes, please rise.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And Councilmember Vogely, will you please read the land acknowledgement?
Happy to, thank you. The City Council wishes to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this place, the Shtahoksh people and their successors, the Tulalip tribes. Since time immemorial, they have hunted, fished, gathered on, and taken care of these lands and waters. We respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, and honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and water. We will strive to be honest about our past mistakes and bring about a future that includes their people, stories, and voices to form a more just and equitable society.
Thank you. We have the minutes of the August 10th meeting on our agenda for approval. Do I hear a motion to approve those?
Vogely moves to approve the meeting's minutes.
Seconded.
We have a motion and a second to approve the August 10th minutes. Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Councilmember Fossey.
Yes.
Councilmember Zarlingo.
Yes.
Councilmember Vogely.
Yes.
Councilmember Toohey.
Yes.
Councilmember Ryan.
Abstain?
President Stonecipher.
Yes. Good evening, Mayor Franklin.
Good evening. No comments, just hope everyone enjoys the weekend. We have fun events coming up this weekend, like we've had almost every weekend this summer, fresh paint downtown, as well as Funko's 5th anniversary. So hope our residents get out and enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you. Angie, do we have anyone signed up to speak this evening?
Good evening. We have no written or public comments this evening.
Thank you. We'll move on to council comments and liaison reports, starting with Councilmember Fossey.
We had a Riveton Planning Committee meeting recently, and I just wanted to say thank you to the staff for giving us a really insightful overview of our permitting processes and things to come before us soon. I think it should be really exciting and great improvement for the community. So thank you again for that presentation.
Thank you. Councilmember Zarlingo.
Only to add a bit to Councilmember Fossey, who's the head of the Planning Committee's comments. It was interesting to see that Everett is a city in terms of getting planning permits, specifically where you can either still go and meet someone at the planning desk and get coaching and information to help you go through a complicated process, and you can also go online and work things out there. So I think that's a great combination of credit to that department making a difficult thing accessible to our community members. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Vogely.
I had something, and I didn't write it down. Glad to be here. Darn it. Oh, yes, okay. So on this Saturday from 10 to 12 at the 3 Mukilteo School District schools in Southwest Everett. So Explorer, Challenger, and Horizon, there is a cleanup, and we need some volunteers. So please, any and all of you, we have it all covered. There will be no drinking of any liquors. Thank you, sir, out there. But we will have water and maybe even juice and probably some teeny little donuts. So come join the Westmont Holly Neighborhood Association to help clean up the school campuses before school starts very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice President Tui.
I have no comment other than hope to see everybody this weekend in downtown Everett for lots of fun. So after you're through cleaning up South Everett.
Thank you. Councilmember Ryan.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I attended the library board meeting last night, and I'm just continually impressed with the amazing work that the library does in our community and the programs that they provide. Another fun event going on this weekend is on Saturday from noon to 4:30 at the Scuttlebutt Tap Room. The library is hosting a Books and Brews event, so you can go and purchase with cash or check only a book, and you can use a card for a brew if you so choose. And so benefits the Friends of the Library Foundation, so it sounds like a really great time. So when you're done cleaning up, before you head to the art show, stop in for a brews, and then you'll be all amped up to grab a whole bunch of art at the fun art show. So, I also wanted to highlight that the Going All City graffiti event. The library has all 5 floors of their parking garage now have a graffiti mural. So swing through and take the loop when you can. It's really amazing work done by a number of artists, and then they also showcase some art from a youth event outside the library as well. So cheers for all of that. And then also coming up on their events, they have a fall gardening series starting this Saturday for the next 4 Saturdays, I believe, and it's in coordination with their seed library. So lots of great stuff, and that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. And I just want to report that the Budget and Finance Committee had a meeting today. I want to thank Vice President Tui for chairing that for me. I was stuck in my car on I-405 and then on I-5. And so we are making our way toward the budget process for the year. We got a great update on our revenue picture for the current year. It's looking good. Revenues are up quite a bit. We're over $3 million in advance of what we're expecting. And so we're seeing some recovery in our community. Of course, it doesn't help us on the expense side because everything else is also inflating on that side too. So a lot of hard work to still be done before we have a balanced budget for the 23 and 24 years. That is all from me. We did have one a speaker request to speak here just now, and it's Jose Villalaz. Please come forward and state your name and the city you live in for the record, and you have 3 minutes to make a comment. Oh, thank you, Angie.
Thank you. I live here in Everett. I live and work in Everett. I've been here for almost 10 years. I live on 3314 Lombard Avenue. In my neighborhood, there is a lot of supportive housing, of which I support. Originally, I'm from Chicago, so I know how it is to live in the big city. I know that other cities have delegated that responsibility to Everett. During the pandemic, my neighborhood has gone through a lot of changes. A lot of supportive housing has been built. I live in front of North Star Apartments, Andy's Place, Hope Works, Compass Health, and I know they're expanding, and I support what they do, but the pandemic has brought out a bad side to what's going on. It has pushed a lot of people into homelessness, and I know that's not an easy subject. What I'm here to speak about is it's becoming a safety issue in our neighborhood on Lombard Avenue, 33rd and 34th Street. A lot of people have taken up residence in their cars and vans, and I understand everybody's different, but what happens is throughout the day and night, sometimes they invite other friends and they spend the night with them. Then I don't know who they are, and neither do my neighbors. So it becomes a safety issue if I walk out. I wake up at 3 in the morning. I go to work really early. So right now it's summer, so when I open my windows, I can hear people outside and the people who live in their cars. It wasn't a big issue when it was colder months because typically I have an alarm system. My neighbors have pets. But right now in the summer months, some of my neighbors don't let their kids out. For me, the issue now has become with all this supportive housing being expanded, it's attracting visitors, and they know how to avoid the rules that the city has for parking enforcement. They will move their cars throughout the day, so they avoid the 72-hour rule. And I understand that if people have their cars registered, they're okay. It's not a crime to live in their cars, I get it. But when they set up residence in our neighborhood for months on end, they leave trash, litter, sometimes drugs. Sometimes they're impaired. So I see that because their home is their car. And sometimes they don't want help from the city. They like living in the streets. But for those of us who live there, it's a safety issue for us because we feel unsafe. Again, I support the supportive housing, but in my neighborhood, for the last few months and after the pandemic we have seen an influx of homeless people. What in my neighborhood we're looking for is if there's a way that the city could help our street limit that kind of parking where people can park so they don't make it a home to live in the street without any repercussions. Because right now they're getting away with just trashing the place without a respect.
Thank you for coming this evening.
We'll make
Mayor
sure,
Franklin.
I know our team has been in touch with you, and we will follow up with you again and try to troubleshoot some solutions that we can work with you and your neighbors on. I totally empathize and understand the challenges that you're dealing with, so thank you for coming.
Okay, and that's all we have there. Do we have an administrative update this evening?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Kimberly Klein would like to just provide some context to one of your consent items, a state grant that we are planning to apply for. So, Kimberly Klein.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Due to the high dollar amount associated with item 7 on the consent agenda, I've been asked to provide you with a bit of background. We are hoping to submit an application for grant funds from the State Department of Commerce through their Connecting Housing to Infrastructure program. The purpose of this particular grant program is to support the development of affordable housing to increase the supply of affordable and high-quality living units. This round of funding specifically supports water, sewer, and stormwater for affordable housing, and will provide funds to offset the utility improvement costs of developing new housing. This grant requires that jurisdictions like cities or counties apply, and that the utility projects serve brand-new multi-unit affordable housing projects that benefit low-income households. The Department of Commerce especially seeks projects outside of King County, which is awesome, because that's us, and they are looking for projects that are either under construction or shovel-ready. Our project team has identified DevCo LLC as an eligible project partner. They are developing the Four Corners Affordable Housing Project on the site of the old Kmart on Evergreen Way. And that project is already underway. And this project will provide 430 new units of permanently affordable housing. We reached out to DevCo, and they are very interested in working with us on this opportunity. So the grant will cover up to $1 million of the costs associated with developing and connecting wastewater, stormwater, or drinking water systems. We estimate that DevCo's utility expenses and the city hookup fees will amount to over $3 million, so this grant could potentially offset about a third of that expense. The city would serve primarily as a pass-through entity, receiving the funds from Commerce and transmitting them to DevCo through some yet-to-be-determined arrangement. I think, as you all know all too well, we need more housing in Everett, and we especially need more affordable housing. Our city teams feel that this opportunity demonstrates to local housing developers that we want and welcome investments like this in our community, and that we'll do what we can to support them. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Councilmember Vogely.
It's not a question, just a comment. I'm watching that be built, since it's been destroyed, the land, whatever. I am so thankful. So yay, thank you for telling everybody more about this and how nice that it is after a constituent came and said, we need more housing. Yes, we do. And now we're going to get some help with building it, permanent supportive. So thank you.
Any other questions? Well, I'll just say that I find this a unique funding methodology for Commerce to be providing the grant to the city for a project that is just passing through to the developer. So from our perspective, this was going to happen no matter what. I mean, I recognize this provides an incentive for maybe new projects, but in this case, there's no net positive impact financially to the city other than, great, we've got a project going forward and we're passing this through to the developer.
That, and as the developer has been going through the project, they've of course experienced some of the supply chain shortages and the inflation costs, which have overall increased the cost of the project to them since the time of the original bid. And so this really helps them out because this is a very expensive project for them.
Right, so we may have some projects that would be on the cusp of maybe whether they can financially pencil or not, and this could help tip those in favorably in our favor.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is, Devco, you're right, would have built this project whether or not this grant came through. This will probably give them capacity to build more similar projects going forward. And they've demonstrated a significant commitment to trying to build projects in Everett.
Yeah, that's great. Good. Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you very much, Kimberly. We will move on and ask City Attorney Hall, do you have anything for us this evening?
No report, no executive session. Thank you.
Okay, great. We will move to our consent agenda then, including item 7. Do I hear a motion to approve the consent items?
Councilor Ryan approves makes a motion to approve all 7 consent agenda items.
Vogely seconds.
Thank you. I have a motion and a second for the consent agenda. Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Councilmember Fosse,
Yes.
Councilmember Zarlingo,
Yes.
Councilmember Vogely,
Yes.
Councilmember Tui,
Yes.
Councilmember Ryan,
Yes.
President Stonecipher.
Yes. We have 5 proposed action items. Items 10, 11, and 12 are first readings, so I'll read them into the record. Item 10 is Council Bill 2207-37. This is the first reading. Adopt an ordinance creating a special construction project entitled Clark Park Gazebo Renovation, Fund 354, Program 078, to accumulate costs for the project in the amount of $30,000. The third and final reading will be held on August 31st in these chambers. Item 11, Council Bill 2207-38, first reading. Adopt an ordinance creating a special construction project entitled Forest Park Spray Pad Recirculation Project, Fund 354, Program 079, to accumulate costs for the project in the amount of $60,000. Third and final reading will also be on August 31st. Item 12 is Council Bill 2207-39, first reading. Adopt an ordinance creating a special improvement project entitled Lower Riverfront Park Renovation, Fund 354, Program 080, to accumulate project costs in the amount of $250,000. Third and final reading will be on August 31st. Do we have any questions on any of the 5 proposed action items?
I had some questions on 10 through 11, 12. Is there somebody from Parks available that could speak to anything?
Unfortunately, Bob Leonard, our Parks Director, wasn't able to attend this evening, but I'm happy to take down questions, and I know he's watching, and
Okay.
we'll respond next week.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Gosh, I lost my page, I'm sorry. Sorry, okay. On item number 10, for the Clark Park gazebo, I had 2 questions. One, in the project summary statement, it shares that additional work required will be to install a decorative sliding locked shutter system and outward opening full-height double locking door. So I was curious about the intent of those 2 improvements or changes to the gazebo, and also just what it might look like, or yeah, just expanding on the reasoning for adding those 2 things in.
Thank you, Councilmember. We'll make sure to get you answers on or before next Wednesday.
Great, and I was also curious about the outreach to the neighborhood and the neighborhood association, because I know they've put a significant amount of work into Clark Park with the mural and hosting events there and whatnot, so I think that they would have, because of the frequency of which they use the park, they would have some suggestions and things that they would like to see as well. Then for number 11, I was just curious if any of the work that's going to be done for the circulation pump is related to the sinkhole that for the down ramp, the like exiting Forest Park, if those things are connected in any way with plumbing and whatnot.
Okay.
And then for number 12, I've been hearing about plans to put in a riverfront trail from Lowell all the way out to Snohomish, which I'm thrilled about. And so I was curious if this project has any overlap with that project coming down the pike, which I think is through some other funding sources, so it might not necessarily be a city project, but it might be something that could be done in collaboration with some other projects already in the works.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll get you answers back next week.
Thank you. Councilmember Vogely.
Thank you much. I did want to let Paula know that you'll get a really great answer from Bob, I'm sure. But when I was on the historical committee, they were talking about the gazebo and all of that stuff. So I'm sure it's been vetted because I was there watching them vet. So that'll be a fun answer, I'm sure. Okay, my questions are for 8 and 9. I can't remember which one because they're both kind of the same. And first of all, so it's about the ordinance amending the Everett Municipal Code to bring into conformity with recently enacted changes, state housing laws, and blah, 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 state housing laws and dwellings and stuff. Okay. After looking through it again, just a real general question, where do you find the key for what P and C and A even stand for? Like, I've gotten an understanding for RS and R1 and R2 and UR after years of listening, but I was like, oh, wait, I don't know P, C, and A. And I think I found it eventually, but yeah, it's kind of tricky. So I'm looking at legal because I mean, I'm sorry, you have a name, David. So I know it's on the website somewhere, but maybe that can just be looked at.
I'll look at it. I don't have it in front of me right now.
Yeah, I
but
wouldn't
yeah,
imagine
there
you
are a couple
would.
places that it probably is located, but
It was very tricky. I bet he has an answer, but just a second. And then, within all of those, and especially for the emergency shelter outdoor, looking at, it's just this thing that we got from last week. I'm showing the camera. Under use, emergency shelter outdoor, there's all of the A's, which I figured out was administrative use with the little 9 number. And that's prohibited except pursuant to blah, and religious organization can do it. Can we, as a city, also accept, it would be an amendment, and we'd have to discuss it, but could we also have it be by nonprofits and/or just organizations that want to help? Is there a reason that it must be acceptable because it's religious? Can we make an addition to, I know that we have to at least have religious, I imagine. Okay.
yeah, there are special rules that apply to religious organizations, and that may be why that is in there as an exception. But I want to consult with Yorick and/or Becky Abelman, who brought this forward, before I gave you a definitive answer on that.
Okay, so I just want to put that out there to my colleagues. Maybe we want not just religious organizations, and there are very many, so whatever. And I'm still remembering, I just want to get out there that the outdoor emergency shelter is we've got to figure out what emergency is, because I'm remembering to, the first summer of COVID and people needing a place, and it being, there's a 90-day permitting process, which doesn't suit emergencies very well. So I'm just bringing that up again, and I'll have a better idea of amendments, I think, by the next time, but it's out there. That's basically all.
And can I just add, so any kind of recommended amendments or ideas you have, it'd be great if you could get those to staff before next Wednesday. That will help York and our team work with you on what that could look like, so that we can make sure that it's prepared for your vote. Thank you.
That is a very good suggestion. I appreciate that.
Thank you, and we have time because this does not come back until the 31st of the month, so you've got some time to work with them. Other questions on proposed action items?
Just a note that I think the P is permitted, C is conditional, and A is administrative. So those are the different categories of process it goes through. Councilmember Fosse
You should
is
figure
more
out
the expert on that.
where that is and help.
Yeah, I didn't see the legend there. I
The
had to
legend,
intuit
the
it as well.
key, but thank you, and that's good for the public as well, so.
Although there is a comment I was going to make, maybe for the future for this, but in terms of conditions on this, some of these things are conditions at the discretion of the planning director. And I think where we are going to have uses that are potentially a concern for the neighborhood or a load on the neighborhood, having a more publicly accessible, easily accessible idea of what those conditions might be, the way those things are evaluated by the planning director and his staff, kind of going into that rather than seeing them as conditions at the end, I think that would help in terms of transparency. Not sure how or if that needs to be or is usefully put into these ordinances as well. I'll be looking at that in the meantime.
Good point, thank you. Any other questions or comments on proposed actions?
I did have one extra one. Also for item number 8, reviewing the slides from last week, there was, one of the slides mentioned general provisions applying to indoor and outdoor shelters and emergency housing, and one of them included staff on duty at all times. And so I will be emailing, just full transparency, I'll be emailing York and Becky this evening to ask if that applies to new projects or would also apply to existing projects.
Excellent. Thank you. Any more on proposed action? We'll move on to our action agenda. Item 13, authorize the mayor to sign change order number 3 with Northwest Construction Incorporated in the amount of $3,898,729.43.
Vogely moves action item number 13.
Discussion?
Do we have a second?
Well, Tui makes a second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. And do we have, I think Ryan Sass is here to give us a few briefing remarks, and then we'll take questions and comments.
Good evening, Ryan Sass with Public Works. As council is aware, the Department of Ecology has ordered us to eliminate or reduce combined sewer overflows. And in 2019, we purchased the industrial treatment works formerly used by Kimberly-Clark to enable us to do so. The city will convert those former treatment works into the Port Gardner storage facility. This is about a $150 million program that we have to have complete by 2027. This project, the Port Combined Sewer, is the pipeline that will connect that future Port Gardner storage facility. This is a mandatory project that we're required to complete in order to comply with Ecology's order. Our pipeline project runs through the former Kimberly-Clark or KC site, which is now owned by the port. As you're aware, the KC site is a long-time industrial site and has undergone numerous hazardous material cleanups and demolition cycles. We anticipated that we could encounter substantial amounts of additional hazardous materials and subsurface materials obstructions, and considered this a high-risk project from the beginning, but one without a viable alternative. The Port of Everett allowed us to obtain an easement to cross the site with our pipeline by the use of an interlocal agreement as approved by City Council in December of 21. Due to the port's development plans, Public Works was required to complete this project on a tight and challenging schedule. Engineering, design, and construction were all required to be complete by June 30th of this year, which was about 6 months from when the ILA was adopted. The port provided us all available subsurface investigations and borings, but there was no ability for the city to complete additional project-specific subsurface investigation. The project's now complete. There's good news and bad news associated with it. The good news is that we did not encounter substantial, high-level contaminated materials that would have required us to chase it outside of the pipeline trench. The other bit of good news is that we completed the project on time and that we were not assessed any liquidated damages under the terms of the ILA. The bad news is that we ran into substantially more subsurface structures and obstructions than estimated by our design consultant based on the available documentation. The contractor ended up having to remove and dispose of 2,130 tons of buried structures and obstructions to complete the pipeline project. At the fixed contract unit price of $1,700 per ton, this adds about $3.3 million to the contract. Although adding the $3.3 million to the contract is painful, it's important to note that this was a no-choice project and required for us to comply with the ecology order. Had we had adequate time to do our own subsurface exploration and been aware of these, we still would have completed the project as it was necessary to do so. Public Works is satisfied that considering the entirety of the project, as it turned out, that the final price of about $9 million is a reasonable and fair price for the completed project. Completing the project with 2,130 tons of structures and obstructions and finishing on time was a huge endeavor for the contract and required them to deploy extra crews, extra equipment, overtime, and many other costs, which all were ultimately covered within the contractor's fixed unit price. This change order 3 covers the additional cost of the work of $3.9 million. This includes $3.3 million for removal of buried structures and obstructions, and the remaining $600,000 for hazardous materials. We'll be following up with a funding ordinance to add additional funds to close out the project. The funding source will be Fund 401, Water and Sewer Utilities, and is funded as a part of the overall $150 million Port Gardner Storage Facility Program.
Thank you, Ryan. Do you have any questions or comments? Seeing none, clerk, will you please take the roll?
Councilmember Fosse,
Yes.
Councilmember Zarlingo,
Yes?
Councilmember Vogely. Yes. Councilmember Tui,
Yes.
Councilmember Ryan,
Yes.
President Stonecipher.
Yes. Item 14, Council Bill 2207-33, third and final reading. Adopt an ordinance creating a special improvement project entitled 2023 Federal Pavement Maintenance Overlay, Fund 303, Program 127. Do I hear a motion?
So moved?
Seconded.
We have a motion and a second. Do we have any questions or comments on item 14? Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Councilmember Fosse,
Yes.
Councilmember Zarlingo,
Yes?
Councilmember Vogely. Yes. Councilmember Tui,
Yes.
Councilmember Ryan,
Yes.
President Stonecipher.
Yes. Item 15, Council Bill 2207-34, third and final reading. Adopt an ordinance creating a special improvement project entitled Water Filter Plant Portal 4 Improvements, Fund 336, Program 018, and repealing ordinance number 3864-22. Do I hear a motion?
So moved?
Second.
A motion and a second. Do we have any questions or comments? Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Councilmember Fosse,
Yes.
Councilmember Zarlingo,
Yes?
Councilmember Vogely,
Yes.
Councilmember Tui,
Yes.
Councilmember Ryan,
Yes.
President Stonecipher.
Yes. And now we'll move on to our council briefing agenda. This item comes before the city council serving as a council committee of the whole and is likely to be scheduled at a future meeting. This is our public safety briefing, and we have both Nick Harper and Chief Templeman here to address us, and thank you. I know this was something that had arisen here in council chambers, and we kicked it around, maybe thinking that the Public Safety Committee would handle it, but it's really great to have you here tonight to address the full council, as it is an item of a lot of interest, so thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Council President Stonecipher. Good evening, Mayor and council members. I am glad to be here tonight to address some public safety concerns and issues that have been raised over the last several months, maybe even last couple of years. And so as we go into this, I understand that public safety obviously is of paramount importance to not only the police department, but the city administration, city council members, in our community at large, and that there's a lot of interest currently in public safety, in some of our strategies, in some of the data and what we're seeing out in our community today that may be a little bit different than what I've seen in my 30-year career, and how we're addressing it, and the reality of some of the challenges that we're facing, and that there are no real good solutions at this point to some of the challenges that we're facing. So as we jump into this, I think it's important that I provide some context about what we're going to talk about tonight and what I intend to talk about, so that not only you all have that basic information, but the community that is watching tonight and maybe watching in the future. So to start, we could spend probably 3 or 4 hours talking about crime data, just crime data. We spend probably 3 hours every month as a leadership team at the Everett Police Department going through crime data, where data is occurring in our city, what types of crime we're seeing, what the crime trends are, where we want to deploy our very limited resources. We will talk about limited resources because that is a very, very real and significant challenge. But we're not going to talk about all that tonight. We're going to really focus on a couple of issues that I think I've heard from many of you about, the mayor's office and the mayor and I, who meet every week to talk about public safety issues and emerging trends and what our staffing looks like, issues that have come into the mayor's office and certainly into my office as well, and for our officers. So we're going to talk about firearms and violent crime tonight. We're going to talk about drugs on our streets and homelessness. We're also going to talk about crime data. I'm going to share some crime data tonight, and I cannot emphasize this enough for each of you and for any media outlets that may be watching this, that the crime data that I'm going to share tonight is what we call living crime data, which means what I share tonight is going to likely be different tomorrow. So people who may believe that we're manipulating data or changing data, that's not the case. It's that this data changes. Some of these cases are recoded in a month from now as detectives investigate cases and determine that it wasn't a burglary, it was just a theft, or it wasn't really an auto theft because the person actually just lost where they placed their car. So there's a lot of stuff that happens with crime data. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that what I'm going to share tonight will look different in the future. I also want to spend a little time talking about law enforcement's role. I think that it's very easy for the community when they see something that they don't like to call 911, because it's really the only number you can call 24/7 and get somebody on the other line. That's what our community has become accustomed to. Our community has become accustomed to Everett Police Department responding to every single call for service, whether it is, and I'm not making this up, you know, the 6-year-old that won't wake up in the morning, that call comes into 911, or, you know, the shots fired call. That's likely going to change at some point in the future, where we are just simply not able to respond to every police call for service because we're operating under this marketing principle of supply and demand. And we have only so many resources, and if the demand outstrips the supply, we've got to make some adjustments. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that. I also want to make sure that everybody understands that public safety is not just a police issue. Okay? Public safety is a community issue. Public safety is an issue that involves other stakeholders. So law enforcement and police are but one stakeholder in a much larger system that involves judges who make decisions about releasing individuals, prosecutors who make decisions about charging individuals, supervision that happens on the backside, and elected officials who make the laws that we enforce. So law enforcement is one part of a much larger system. And then we're going to wrap up with Deputy Mayor Harper just giving a high-level overview of the mayor's regional public safety initiative that Mayor Franklin's been working on with her peers here in Snohomish County. So, factors that impact crime. There are a lot of different factors that impact crime. This is just a high-level overview here of some of the issues that we're seeing in Everett that are not necessarily unique to just Everett, but we're seeing them region-wide and throughout the state. Obviously, the pandemic has had an impact on crime. And you'll see in some of the data that in 2020, some of the crime and some of the categories that we're looking at did drop. It dropped for a variety of reasons. Part of it was that, officers were not, we adjusted our response protocols to certain types of calls. Our officers at the beginning of the pandemic, when we knew very little about how the virus was spread and the impact, we weren't necessarily engaging proactively to the same level that we were previously. Jail restrictions went into effect, significant jail restrictions in 2020 when the pandemic started. And as we're coming out of the pandemic, this is something, I don't know if it's unique. I've not lived through a pandemic before, but some members of our community are not doing well, and they're struggling for a lot of different reasons. And what connection and how much can we attribute to the pandemic? I can't measure that, but I know that there's an impact as a result of the pandemic. Second bullet, I debated on whether or not to put fentanyl 3 times. Fentanyl, fentanyl, fentanyl. This is another real significant problem on our streets. And again, not unique to Everett, but in talking with our officers, listening to the radio, getting briefed by some of our specialized units, fentanyl is pervasive throughout our community. And obviously we're still seeing meth and heroin as well. Fentanyl, obviously highly addictive, cheap on the street, very dangerous, and very difficult to come off of if you're going into treatment and whatnot. The effects are much more significant on the body than maybe if you're trying to come off of some of the other drugs that people may be addicted to. So fentanyl is a real problem out on our streets. Firearms, you're going to see some data on firearms that is concerning about the number of firearms that are stolen in our community, the number of firearms are being used in crimes in our community. State law changes. I'm not going to say that all of our crime increase is attributed to the changes in state law, but I will acknowledge that there is some impact with some of the laws that have been changed and how those have impacted officers' ability to take enforcement action when the community may think that we're able to take certain action and we may be limited in what our response and enforcement actions are. We'll talk a little bit about the state Supreme Court decision and the Blake decision as it relates to possession of controlled substance, and then the legislature's response with their engrossed Senate Bill 5476. And then, of course, the other. I just leave that in there because there are other factors that impact crime in our community. The last thing before we jump into some of the data, I just wanted to address, and this is just because I have a problem with, let's say, transitioning to new terms sometimes. So the previous to 2016, the FBI, when we report all our crime to the FBI every year, we would report under what's called the UCR, or the Uniform Crime Report. Violent crime was the category that we always reported on. That's where murders, rapes, not robberies, arson, shootings, assault, felony assaults, those were all violent crimes. In 2016, when we transitioned into the new FBI data collection system, which is known as the National Incident-Based Reporting System, which is NIBRS, they changed that to crimes against persons. So my analysts always correct me when I say violent crime, they say crimes against persons. If you hear me say either of those, I mean the same thing. And this is really for my crime analysts because they're going to watch this, I'm sure. And so we're going to talk about violent crime. You're going to see that violent crime is on the rise. It's not at its highest point. I mean, you'll see from some of the data that we had higher violent crime in 2017, 2018, but you can't dispute the fact that our violent crime is on the rise. And that's a concern for me as a public safety official here in Everett. You're going to see that shootings and guns are significantly increasing, and that's within that category. And then you're also going to see that gang offenses are also on the increase, and we'll talk a little bit about gang offenses and how we categorize something as a gang offense. So the first piece of data that I want to share here tonight is, again, crimes against persons or violent crime. And what you're going to see here is just a high-level overview, again, of where we've been since 2016. The bar on the left, which is the blue bar, and really shows January through June. And that's what we're going to talk about here today is January through June. Because even though we do have data now for July, when I put this together, we did not have the July data yet fully prepared. So you can see in the blue line to the left that we had higher levels in 2016, 2017. We saw decreases, in those 4 to 5 years. And then starting really in 2020, 2021, and now into 2022, we're starting to see those numbers creep up. So we're at 835 violent crimes so far, January through June of this year, where we were at 782 last year and 751 the year before. So again, not an exponential increase in violent crime, but an increase nonetheless. And then, of course, on the far right side, the bars, the orange or yellow bars, show the final numbers at the end of the year. And the one for 22 is just a projection based upon the first 6 months of the year. Yes, Councilmember.
Just a quick question, because it's going to, okay, crimes against persons and then violent crime. I know that animals aren't people, but it's a violent crime, which is like a murder. So is that in there?
No.
Just
No.
curious.
No.
Because
Yeah.
I think of these things.
Crimes, animal cruelty, those are in, I believe, they're crimes, a different category that we'll talk about very much later. Crimes against society, I believe, is where animal cruelty. So there's crimes against persons, crimes against property, crimes against society, and nuisance crimes are kind of the categories. We're really talking about the crimes against persons here in this category.
Thank you.
You bet. Select violent crimes here. So now we're going to kind of start drilling down a little bit more specific into some of the most common crimes that involve weapons here. And what you see in this graph, it's a little busy, but what I really want to draw your attention to on the far right-hand side, obviously, are our estimated 22 year-end numbers based on the first 6 months of the year. And with the exception of aggravated assaults, which are felony assaults, which is the highest bar there, the concern, obviously, that I have are the other three: murder, robbery, and weapons violations. If the last 6 months of the year play out the way the first 6 months of the year have, we're going to be at record highs since 2018. And again, concern for me as chief, I'm sure concerning for the mayor as we've met and talked about these numbers, and certainly our community members as well. And this slide is also, the next few slides I think are also fairly concerning as far as trends are concerned. We began tracking shots fired calls in 2017. This is not something that the FBI requires that we collect data on. It's something that we felt we needed to be collecting data on. And what this slide shows is, and again, a little bit busy, the bar on the left shows shots fired calls January through June in each of those years. The total numbers, that number on the left, the number in the parentheses that you see at the top is drive-by shootings. So we not only track shootings, but we also track drive-by shootings. And so you can see where we're at this year in 2022 far exceeds where we've been since we started tracking this data. I, as the chief, am very, very concerned about the number of shots fired calls, the number of drive-by shooting calls that we're seeing in the city. It doesn't make me feel any better to know that this is not unique, again, to Everett, that and if you followed any of the news, you're seeing other communities that are also being significantly impacted by gun crimes and shots fired calls, and calls where you have, 80 to 100 rounds being fired, in one single incident. this is a concern, and this should be a concern throughout the entire state of Washington, in my opinion, and one that I don't know is getting enough attention, publicly right now here, but one that does concern me. And this too, this slide here with stolen firearms, again, another data point that we are not required to collect, but one that we have. We also collect as part of this where firearms are stolen from. We track whether they're stolen from vehicles or from residences. I can tell you that through through July of this year, that I think it was 74 firearms stolen out of homes, 36 out of vehicles. We try to put out a lot of social media, public education announcements about securing weapons, being a responsible gun owner if you're going to own a firearm. But I will tell you, I was told in a briefing that I had the other day that in some of these cases, people are breaking into homes and they're just stealing the entire safe. So even people that may be securing their firearms in a responsible manner may still find themselves as a victim of a firearm theft. Yes.
I have to say, I did not mean to laugh like that, but, because gun safes are really heavy. So like, how are they stealing an entire safe without
Some
a
are.
truck?
Some are, and some aren't, right? Some are smaller, some are secured, in different places, and sometimes, people don't even secure those gun safes. So, but there are ways, where there's a will, there's a way. So stolen firearms, obviously, we're potentially, right, at record levels by the end of the year. Weapon law violations. Weapon law violations would be offenses like unlawful possession of a firearm, which would be like maybe a convicted felon that's prohibited from possessing a firearm, that has a firearm, unlawful use of a weapon to intimidate another, unlawful discharge of a weapon in the city. It's those types of crimes. Once again, if you look at our trend through the first 6 months, we are far above where we've ever been since we've been tracking this data in the first 6 months, and certainly on pace by the end of the year to be very high in that category as well. So gang-related cases, obviously, well, it may not be obvious to everybody, that the Everett Police Department stood up a gang response unit under Mayor Franklin's when she first came into office, because when you look at some of that data, when I talk about 2016 and 17, when they were at record highs then, Mayor Franklin took office, and it was one of her first priorities was to address the gun, gang, and youth violence that we were seeing in our community, especially when we were having young kids and one young teenager who was shot and killed out in South Everett. And so we stood up this unit. It involves a prevention and intervention component as well. But this unit is up and operational, barely. Our staffing, again, is challenged, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But this slide here, what I really want to draw your attention to is, once again, if you look at 2022 and you see where we're at for the first 6 months and where we're projected to be by the end of the year, once again, the projections are we would be at our highest point since 2018. The FBI requires that we report certain gang-related offenses to them. There's 11 offenses. They're mostly serious offenses. They're mostly crimes against persons. They're listed here: murder, negligent manslaughter, kidnapping, abduction, robbery, sexual assault offenses, and assault offenses. That's the number in parentheses. Those numbers, those types of offenses, thankfully, aren't as frequent as some of the other gang-related offenses that may occur in the city. So we also, in addition to what we are required to report to the FBI, we also track other offenses that may be gang-related that the FBI doesn't require we report. For example, graffiti. We think that gang-related graffiti, and knowing where that's occurring, knowing what groups are out there and who's covering up whose tag, is very, very important for us to know, so that we can deploy correct resources. We may be able to get into a community and do some intervention work. It's tough right now because of resources, but we do track things like that. So that's why we've got the two different numbers. The number in parentheses is what we would report to the FBI, and the other number that's not in parentheses is what what our numbers are just by tracking. Our gang response unit sergeant reviews every single report before we categorize it as a gang offense. It is the criteria for identifying an offense as a gang offense is outlined in state law. And that's what we use as the basis for determining whether or not an offense is a gang-related offense or not. Okay, so enough data on crimes against persons. Now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about our response, some of our challenges, and what our strategies are moving forward. Our response to this is, obviously I mentioned the gang response team and our anti-crime team units. We still have these units up and operational, and I'm really glad that we're able to keep some level of resource in place to address some of these issues. If we did not have these teams right now out there doing the work that they're doing, I can promise you that these numbers would be much, much higher. I don't know where they'd be, but I can tell you they'd be higher. These teams do amazing work. They are interacting and arresting some of the most dangerous in our community that are victimizing other people and creating danger for our community at large. So we have those teams still operational today. We have made some adjustments, and we've been working with the prosecutor's office as well, the county prosecutor's office, on some of the unlawful possession of firearm cases. We have now streamlined our process internally to where all of our unlawful possession of firearm cases are going to one. It's 2 detectives right now. It's eventually going to be 1. And we've worked with the Snohomish County Prosecuting Attorney's Office to do the same thing there. And that allows us to not let cases get lost. It allows us to develop subject matter experts that know the system, that know what boxes need to be checked, and are able to process those cases much more efficiently than when they were just assigned to any detective at large, and same with the prosecutor's office. So we appreciate the cooperation that we're seeing from Snohomish County Prosecuting Attorney's Office on some of these. We're also requesting exceptional bail requests when we encounter individuals that we do deem to be either prolific or chronic individuals that are putting our community at risk. And again, we can request it. The prosecutor's office can request it. Ultimately, it is a judge that's going to make that decision, and we have no control over that whatsoever. Extreme risk protection orders. Wanted to just touch on this for a moment. You may have seen, in the last couple of weeks, an article in a local media publication about extreme risk protection orders. These, some people know these as kind of the red flag laws that have been trying to get passed at the federal level, where if law enforcement or a family member through a court proceeding is able to articulate that an individual poses a risk to the community and a danger to the community and has access to firearms, that we're able to go to court through a judicial process and recover those weapons and prohibit them from acquiring more weapons. We have been very, very aggressive in this arena since this law went into effect in 2017. And as the article pointed out, just the Everett Police Department alone has applied for and pursued more than 50% of all extreme risk protection orders throughout the entire county here in Snohomish County. And so we're fortunate because we have a police legal advisor, and she is assigned to work these cases, and we also have one dedicated detective that's also assigned to work these cases. So we're fortunate in that regard, but again, you never know what crimes you've prevented, right, by restricting access to firearms by people that have been determined by a court to be a danger to the community. And then the last one I wanted to touch on was this National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. We know this as NIBIN. This is an ATF, or a Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms program that analyzes shell casings. So every drive-by shooting, we collect shell casings from the street. Every shooting that occurs inside a building, we collect shell casing. Every gun we collect, we test fire at our range and send the shell casing into this national database where they compare the shell casings to other crimes, and so that we can maybe make connections if there's a drive-by shooting in Everett, in Seattle, in Bellevue, and maybe Seattle makes an arrest, and then we can start working back and tying those weapons, maybe to identify suspects in those cases. We've been very active in that program as well. Yes, council member.
What should one do if they find a spent shell casing somewhere when they're doing a litter
Well-
cleanup, say, on Casino?
You know, the reality is, you know, I'd love to say, hey, you know, call 911 or bring it into the police, right? After I just got done telling you, you know, at the beginning of this presentation that our resources are severely lacking. I think if there's reason to believe that, you know, if somebody comes across a shell casing and they knew that there was a shooting the night before, that might be a relevant time to call and report that. If you're just, you know, and I've found shell casings out in community as well, you know, not working, but my community where I live. And you know, those can be just disposed of. But again, if there's information that you or any of your neighbors or people have that there was something that happened, you can certainly give us a call. Okay. Challenges. Stolen guns, obviously on the rise. We went through that data. I won't spend a whole lot of time on that. These next few are I'll kind of combine them into one bullet. I was briefed by our gang response unit and anti-crime team. They have never seen as many guns on people as what they're coming into contact with today. And they basically say, you know, if somebody's out in the community and they're trafficking narcotics, they've got a gun. So it's just they come together now. And so obviously you can imagine the, you know, the heightened sense of awareness and concern that the officers that are working these cases have when they're working a case that involves narcotics trafficking. They have to prepare that that person's likely going to be armed, either in the vehicle or on their person. And while that's always been, you know, there's always been, you know, drugs and weapons kind of are connected, they're seeing it at a much higher frequency than they have in the past. Yes, sir.
Do you see that primarily as a drugs and weapons kind of nexus? Is it also gangs and weapons? Does some of the weapons increase track the gang increases?
Absolutely, yeah. So drugs, and again, sometimes it's all three, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's guns, drugs, and weapons. Sometimes, you know, we do encounter, you know, people that are trafficking narcotics that have no affiliation with a gang at all. But yeah, we see that as well. Challenges, court backlogs. You know, there was an article, you know, a few months back about some of the backlogs caused by the pandemic in Snohomish County Superior Court. It's real. It's significant. You know, if they don't have the staffing and the funding to be able to timely prosecute cases and have to dismiss cases because the statute of limitations has passed, that's a problem. There's no accountability there. And so I know that they're working on it. And again, I appreciate their cooperation with us and willingness to talk to us. Repeat offenders and court releases. You know, the individuals that we're coming into contact with that are causing the greatest risk to our community, many of them, a high percentage, have criminal history. And I'm not talking about just one or two convictions for felonies, but 12. We know that the individual that shot our officer had 12 that we know of. That's not uncommon, 12 to 20 or more felony convictions. At some point, and I'm not going to say what that is, but at some point I think the community has to say how many felonies is too many felonies, how many victims is too many victims for an individual to be out in our streets continuing to victimize the community. And I will leave it at that, but I will say that that's a concern that we have when our officers are contacting the same people over and over and over again with guns or with drugs or who have victimized other people. And then I wanted to just spend maybe a couple minutes here talking about staffing, because I think that staffing, you know, it plays into this. We are operating on our specialty units at anywhere from 25 to 50% of our regular staffing. We last year hired 12 police officers in 2021. In 2022, you know, one of our strategic initiatives was to hire 25 officers this year, which would have be a record. We're at 22 right now as of August. I know we're going to exceed 25 officers, which is great. And the team is doing great work hiring really good new officers. You're going to swear in 6 new officers here in a couple weeks. But I still have 24 vacant positions, and that's after hiring 22 officers. And the reality of it is that I don't just have 22 vacant positions, I actually have 57 vacant positions, because what's not factored in to our vacancy rate is I've got 24 positions that are unfilled. I also have, officers who are in field training right now, so they're not working solo patrol. I have officers that are in the academy. I have officers that are waiting months to go to the academy. I have officers that are out on military leave. I have officers that are out on long-term injuries caused by getting into fights at work. So when you factor in all those numbers, it's 57 officers that were down. So that's a concern. Now, when I talk to my peers throughout Snohomish County, they're experiencing a very similar trend, even outside of Snohomish County, very similar trend. So while we continue to hire officers, we continue to lose officers too. We're at 40 officers now that we've lost in the last 2 years. Many to retirement, but others that are looking to work elsewhere. They're looking to get out of police work. They're looking to work in other states in law enforcement. And then there's some that are retiring, that are just like, okay, now's the time to go. So when I talk about staffing, this is a real issue. If we don't have enough officers out to respond to a 911 call that somebody's breaking into my house, that's a problem, right? And so those are our priorities right now. Those are where we're focusing our efforts. And so that's why, we're going to talk about drugs and homelessness and unsheltered and some of the quality of life crimes. Those are still very, very important to us, but we may not be responding to some of those as quickly as we did in the past, because we have to really focus our resources on those high priority persons crimes. And I wish I could say something better about that, but that's just the reality of where we're at today. So, strategy moving forward. Continue as much as we can. And again, I look to the mayor, because she always tells me when I've told her before, I'm going to have to, maybe look at standing down one of these units. And she's like, whatever you can do not to do that, we need to be looking at all other options. So continue as much as we can to staff our anti-crime and gang response units. And we're doing that right now, and they're doing, again, a great job. Continuing to focus some of our special operations on some of the most violent offenders in our community and the ones that are repeatedly victimizing other individuals. Regional violent crime collaboration. So the previous slide, I said we're operating at about 25 to 50% of staffing in some of these specialized units. These officers are dealing with the most dangerous individuals in our community. There's a concern I have about their safety when they're operating at such short staffing. So we have, as of yesterday, stood up a regional violent crime reduction unit. And that unit is comprised of the Everett Police Department, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, the Linwood Police Department, the FBI, and the Snohomish County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. And so we really believe, because we have found that a lot of these individuals that are victimizing community members aren't just victimizing community members in Everett. They're victimizing people in unincorporated South County, and as you all probably heard about, a couple of young kids that were murdered in Linwood recently. And so we really believe that by collaborating and combining some of our resources for the next 60 days and then reevaluating after that makes sense. And it's doing something, right? It's doing something to try to curb the violence that we're seeing out in our streets and out in our community. And so we have members from all those units. I will mention that the FBI component, because people might go, why is FBI involved? They're really involved. They've got an agent that's involved with us and a victim advocate. And they're really looking at it from the exploitation perspective, and especially as it relates to gang and gang involvement, that we know that some of these young kids that are involved in some of these gangs are being exploited by adults and are being brought into the gangs. And so if we can bring to bear federal resources to help with intervention, help with prevention, to help provide resources to some of these kids, their families, that maybe we can, stop that trend into the future. So we're really excited to have the FBI as part of that, as part of our team. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is a program that I've talked with the mayor about as well, and she's been very supportive. Some of you may have heard about Kirkland about a month ago or so, Kirkland Police Department and the city hosting a Guns for gift card event. This is kind of like a gun buyback event, and I know that there's been some interest expressed in something like this by Councilmember Toohey as well. And so we're looking at hosting a couple of our own events. We're really looking at funding and whatnot right now to where we would allow community members to come in and drop off unwanted firearms. In an exchange for that, they get a gift card. And it may be a gas gift card. It may be, there's just different ways of doing it. There's accounting for all of the gift cards. There's a whole process that goes that's involved in this. But in Kirkland, in 2 weekends, they collected over 145 guns that people didn't want. And when you think about this, right, these are guns that are maybe in homes, maybe in glove boxes, that now are not in homes and in glove boxes, where we know that if somebody goes and breaks into that house, maybe it's going to be a firearm that won't get out on the street and won't be used in a crime. So we're hoping to see a similar success rate, if not more. In talking with the deputy chief from Kirkland PD, he said that they had people coming in and dropping off guns even when they ran out of gift cards that said, I don't want this anymore. I didn't know what to do with it, but I know by giving it to you that it won't get into the wrong hands. And so we're very excited to be able to really explore that as an opportunity here in the coming months. Okay, I'm going to transition here, and I apologize for the length of this presentation, but I'm going to transition into this next section on what I call quality of life crimes. By calling and categorizing these as quality of life crimes, I'm in no way trying to minimize the impact that these crimes have on our community members and on our business community as well. But really focusing here on narcotics or on some of our unsheltered population, behavioral health concerns, trespass, and theft. Again, looking at just some data here, high-level data. This is that category, Councilmember Vogely, that I mentioned about crimes against society. This is, again, one of the categories that we do have to report to the FBI. This involves crimes like drug possession of drug paraphernalia. So you will see a very notable drop in these crimes. And you may think to yourself, that's really odd, because I'm seeing conditions out on the street worse than I've ever seen them before, and my constituents are reporting conditions worse than I've ever seen them before. How could there be such a decline? Well, this is where the state Supreme Court decision on Blake certainly factors in. And again, this is the state Supreme Court decision in 2021, early 2021, where the state Supreme Court ruled our drug possession law unconstitutional. And for a couple months, 2.5 months or so, while the state legislature, drafted their bill, I don't know how many of you knew this, but all drugs were legal in Everett statewide. It didn't matter if it was cocaine, meth, heroin, legal. Our officers, during that period had zero enforcement. The state then enacted Engrossed Senate Bill 5476, which was a temporary fix, if you will, to the Blake decision, which recriminalized possession, not as a felony any longer, but as a misdemeanor crime. And it also mandated that officers could not book an individual into jail if they were caught smoking meth, let's say, or shooting up heroin, or in possession of a controlled substance until at least the third time. They had to refer those individuals to services at least 2 times. And on the third time, the officer has the discretion to make that arrest. And so, and it's really interesting, in talking to the officers working the street, there were people right away that said, you can't arrest me for this. And I thought this was legal. These are some of the direct quotes that I'm getting from the officers that were working and still continue to work. So that's where this decline really occurred. And I think it's important for everybody to understand that the city, similar to firearm laws, the city is preempted from enacting a law that is stricter than state law when it comes to possession of controlled substance. So that Everett could not go and enact its own, let's say, crime that says, okay, if you're caught in possession of heroin, it's a misdemeanor, and you can be subject to arrest right away. We are not allowed to do that, and so I think it's important that community understands that, that we are bound by state law here. So that was the biggest driver here. Possession of drug paraphernalia, also for personal use, is now legal. So that is no longer illegal. So pipes, tutors, needles, foil, all that kind of stuff, legal. That's through state law, and we cannot criminalize that.
Change the law.
So the other thing, and this might be one of the data points that if you were to ask me a question about this, that I'm not going to be able to answer, because I would think this slide right here is drug calls for service. So these are 911 calls for service about drugs and drug complaints. And it also shows officer initiated as well. And you can see that officer initiated, which is the blue at the top, has dropped obviously since 2016. Part of that, is due to legislation. Some of it was due to pandemic. But we also saw a drop in community calls for service to 911 about drugs. Now maybe our community became aware of the Blake decision and the new state law, and so maybe they thought, I'm just not going to call. But I would have thought, based on what I'm seeing in my office and maybe what you're hearing from your constituents, that this trajectory would be probably at an all-time high, community members calling in. But it's not. But I have another slide that's going to contradict this in just a couple minutes here. This here are just arrests. These are drug and narcotic arrests. And again, this follows that similar trend to the first slide, so I don't really need to spend a whole lot of time here. It's really just to show that just this different approach in the state of Washington to drug possession and kind of some of the limitations that law enforcement is under when it comes to this. This drug equipment, this is the drug paraphernalia piece. This is probably the most dramatic decrease, but again, this is because this is no longer illegal at all. To possess drug paraphernalia for personal use. There are some exceptions, and that's why you still see some arrests that are still occurring here. One note that I did want to make with respect to the referrals, a couple slides back, I was talking about the Blake decision. I was talking about the new legislation that the state passed in 2021 that mandated that officers make referral to services at least 2 times before they could make a physical arrest and a booking. We do track. Initially, when this law first passed, there was no funding from the state. There was no system for law enforcement to track whether you got referred for services in Seattle and then you came to Everett. We had no way of knowing whether or not they'd been referred for services, or Linwood, or even Marysville for that matter. We had to develop our own system, and we've developed it. It's not perfect, but it's a system that we have. I had our analysts go in and look, and our outreach team sergeant go in and look at the referrals, and we've tracked about a little over 200 referrals that we have made under the new law for services. And granted, maybe some of those individuals have reached out to other organizations, but our referrals have our COET team as one of the organizations that you can reach out to get services. And not one person out of all the 200, none of them have contacted our COET team. Now, it's possible they may have contacted some other organization, but I thought that was an interesting data point. And in talking to some of my peers, they're experiencing a very similar trend that those referrals are not really garnering a whole lot of actual people taking services as a result of that. And then the last data point I just wanted to show, because I know that you all get complaints and concerns about vandalism. Catalytic converter thefts are through the roof. And we're doing a lot here in Everett. That may be a public safety topic, in the future, but we're doing probably more than many, many other agencies when it comes to catalytic converter theft investigations and proactive operations on catalytic converters. Trespass, shoplift, thefts, burglaries, those are all in this category. This is not surprising to see this data increasing. Our property crimes unit, unfortunately, is about 50% staffed, our detectives in property crimes. So investigating these crimes takes time and has been fairly difficult. This was the slide that I was going to tell you that is maybe a little bit contrary to that previous slide that I had talked about, where we saw the drug abuse, drug calls for service dropping. We, as part of our 911 system, Everett was the first department to go live with this in May of 2021 with this new platform that allows us to interact with 911 callers and give them updates on how long it's going to be for an officer to get there. And then we're able to actually follow up with victims of crime after a case via text messaging. We also survey not all, but a vast majority of our 911 callers. And one of the questions in the survey is, what is your greatest community safety concern? For the last 2 years, this has been pretty steady. This is this year's data so far. In 2021, the numbers were higher because we had obviously a full year's worth of data, but the same 3 topics in the same order. You don't see guns, you don't see shootings, you don't see felony assaults. I don't know what to say as a chief. I get it that this is important, and I get it that this is visible and that this affects everybody. But to not see firearms and violent crime as a concern, I still try to figure that out myself. I realize that violent crime doesn't affect, the vast majority of our community. And I always say, it doesn't affect you until it does. And then what? Then it's too late. So nonetheless, we do have resources dedicated here, and that's what I want to talk about now. Our community outreach and enforcement team, again, 1,700 contacts in just the first 6 months of this year, 6 or 7 months of this year. They've referred 12 individuals into LEAD, the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program that we're piloting with Snohomish County Prosecuting Attorney's Office and Linwood PD. 18 clients into inpatient treatment, 26 into the diversion center, 31 into motels, and 35 into pallet shelters. So, and then 80 arrests. I think that that's important for our community to understand as well, because I think many people think that we don't arrest people anymore. And that's just, nothing could be further from the truth. We are still, and this is with our outreach team. We've got some other special teams that are out, and they're more enforcement focused than this team. So for this team to be making 80 arrests in the first 6 months is important, but they always offer outreach first. They're always trying to get people hooked into services first. But just think about this. Some people may go, only 12 lead referrals, only 26 or 18 into treatment, 31 into motels. Those are significant numbers. Those are people that were out on the street. Those are people that were in that business doorway. Those are people that were sleeping in the park. I realize we still have people doing that, and we're still working to address that. But these are real numbers, and these are tangible, right? These are people that would otherwise be out in our community still struggling.
Chief, the ones that are not, 18 in, inpatient, 31 in motels, the vast majority of those 1,700 contacts are refusing services, correct? I just want to be very clear. It's not that we are not offering and not getting them in touch with service providers. They are simply refusing services. So it's a very service-resistant population that we are working with on the streets right now.
Very, very good point. And something that, that surprised me a little bit, but that's what my outreach team and some of our special enforcement teams are saying, is that the individuals that we're dealing with now out on the streets, the people that want help and are willing to get services, a vast majority of them have received them. Now, we're still seeing new faces that come into town, and some of them are willing to accept services, but the mayor makes a very good point there. Challenges. We've already really talked about this. I will just mention, obviously there's always this lack of treatment resources. I'd love to have on-demand, treatment where our co-ed team can pick up somebody and bring them right into treatment or an assessment. We're able to do that at sometimes, but it's not something that's readily available all the time. Lack of coordination among service providers. I talk about this, and I remember Deputy Chief DeRoos years ago when we were working with one of our social service providers, and we were talking about operating in silos, that police operate here, the mission may operate here, and other organizations, faith-based organizations operate here, And we really tried to break that down, and we had some success doing that. I think we're kind of back into silos again a little bit. And so, you know, there are organizations out there that mean well and are out there to help the population that's on the street and struggling, but they're creating other problems and other issues that are creating issues for the neighborhoods and the communities that you all are representing. And you're hearing from them about garbage and about different issues, or people going to the bathroom in places and whatnot. So, you know, it would be great to be able to really, you know, be able to coordinate again with these entities. And if you're going to provide food service, provide restroom and provide garbage and provide a monitor and, you know, those kinds of things that I think, you know, those are not law enforcement issues, but we care about those issues. And then, you know, I'll just mention staffing issues. I talked about it for police. You know, I think we need to create an environment in the state of Washington where people want to be police officers. And I don't know that we're there today, but we need to. And the same holds true, I think, with some of these social workers and other entities. They're struggling to get employees as well. All right, and I think we're nearing the end here, so just bear with me. Strategy, continue to staff our outreach team to the extent we can. We will continue to do that. Our special operations, we talked about timely access to treatment and shelter. This is really important. We really need to be advocating, and if I could ask you all to help support us in advocating for an effective fix to the Blake decision, right? And one that allows law enforcement and government to be able to respond to community concerns and gives us a little bit more discretion back in those. I really think that could help. And it doesn't mean that we will arrest every single person and put them in jail, but it means that when we're dealing with a certain neighborhood that's being hit really hard, maybe it's one of your districts, that law enforcement has the tools to be able to address that. Alternate response, we continue to look at that. Julie Willie with Community Development, myself, Chief DeMarco, I know Abby from the library, we've all been looking at that. We've met with representatives from Albuquerque, alternate response, Mount Vernon alternate response. We're looking at, you know, where are our gaps here? What could alternate response look like here in Everett? So again, by alternate response, I mean a team of people that go out and respond to certain types of calls that come into 911 or some other system that may not involve a police officer responding at all. So we're looking at that, looking at the funding opportunities. What might that cost? Could we launch a pilot? Some of those things. So we continue to look at that. I'm a big supporter. I know the mayor is as well. And I also want to just mention the 988 system. It hasn't gotten a whole lot of publicity, but it is now live. I know that in the next 2 to 3 years, part of that system includes mobile crisis response, which I'm excited about. I don't yet know what it's going to look like, and neither do the people that I've talked to, but they're talking about that. The great thing about our 988 system is it is funded. So I think we're one of 4 states in the country maybe that actually have a fee that's applied to phone lines. And so it's going to fund this whole system. And so I look forward to us being involved in those discussions moving forward as to how that might meld with an alternate response that we may stand up prior to the next 2 to 3 years. And then advocating for accountability throughout the criminal justice system. And so this is my last slide, and this is my feeble attempt at incorporating algebra symbols into my presentation for those of you that didn't know what I was doing here. But my point is, you know, as you lower accountability in the criminal justice system, it's going to lead to an increase in crime. And I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, because law enforcement is part of that criminal justice system. So for example, if me as chief, and if I'm not doing enough to hire enough officers to meet the demand that we have in our community, that may mean that the police aren't being as accountable as we need to be for our part of the system, right? If prosecutors aren't filing timely charges, or they're dismissing cases when they shouldn't be, there's a lack of accountability there. If judges are releasing dangerous, prolific offenders back into the community, there's an accountability piece there. And so in elected officials, right, that are making some of these laws, if they're not making laws that are effective in addressing the community issues that we're facing today, then there's a lack of accountability. So I'm not saying in any one entity, but collectively, that as that accountability lowers in the system, crime is going to increase, period. That's just a fact. And so, I look forward, as the Everett Police Department, to being involved as much as we can and being a contributing stakeholder and doing what we can to be as accountable as we can for our part of this entire system, and hope that you all will help advocate from your positions for accountability in the other parts of the system as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Deputy Mayor Harper to give a brief overview of the mayor's public safety initiative, and then certainly I'll be here for follow-up questions after Deputy Mayor Harper.
Whatever.
Deputy
I'll be
Chief.
exceptionally brief. Thank you, Chief Templeman. I think I want to be very brief. What I think is important to take away is you're all exceptionally fortunate as municipal elected leaders to be in nonpartisan office. This isn't a left issue or a right issue. This is a community issue. I get emails from all of you and more every day from our residents that are concerned about everything Chief Templeman has just described for the last 35, 40 minutes. So for the last year or more, the mayor has been working with mayors across the 20-ish cities and towns in Snohomish County. I think they've achieved virtual unanimity on shared concerns, shared desires for improvement in their communities. Certainly there are things we can do as a city, some of which the chief articulated. There are things we need to work with our county prosecutor's office, our Superior Court judges, the county writ large, the state, and our federal partners to deal with. I think we'll be coming back in December like we always do with a legislative agenda, and some of these items will be on that. Certainly the legislature allowing law enforcement countywide, statewide to interact with our drug-challenged residents more productively is critical. There's also significant issues with mental health and competency and how the law enforcement community as well as our mental health providers interact with those people and how they are treated, provided services, sometimes when they might not recognize they need those services is going to be a critical issue for us to grapple with. So none of these are going to be easy challenges. They're all going to be politically charged. But again, I think what is productive about mayors and cities aligning on this is we can set aside some of the typical partisan political issues and think about these as community issues and how we move our city, the cities throughout Snohomish County, the Puget Sound, the state of Washington, and across the country in a more productive and less volatile way. So that's the goal, more to come, but just wanted to kind of highlight that there is going to be a significant advocacy component to this because there's nothing that we as a community can do to solve these problems on our own. These are system-wide issues that are going to require significant system-wide solutions. And I think we have great partners in Snohomish County, in our state legislative delegation, our congressional delegation, but we're all going to have to work together. And I just want to make sure that's a clear component of the discussion tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we'll go down the line and see if we have any questions or comments, starting with Councilmember Fosse.
Thanks. I want to say that I appreciate your preface when you're coming out and explaining all this, and very thankful for the leadership that we have at our Everett PD. It's above and beyond, in my opinion. So I have a few questions. When it comes to fentanyl, what is kind of the current status on treatment with that? Have they found treatment that is actually comparable yet? That's widely used.
Yeah, I'm not certainly the expert in that, but and maybe the mayor has a comment here, but my understanding is they're using treatment, that they've used to, help people get off of heroin and meth, and it's not quite as effective with fentanyl.
So there's not.
Yeah,
Okay.
I met with Providence staff and with Representative Larson and Senator Murray's team, and we discussed this, and we had the treatment providers there, nurses and others that basically said they've never seen anything like this. It's 10 times worse than heroin. We had people in recovery there that told and shared their stories. It is, we do not have a system. There is no system set up to deal with fentanyl. We are woefully not prepared for this crisis, and it is all over our streets. So there are people that are receiving treatment, but they're receiving very similar treatment to how we treat heroin addicts, and it is not enough for those that are trying to get off fentanyl. So it's going to be a challenge for some time.
That was not the answer I was hoping for, but it was unfortunately what I suspected. With regards to the firearms update, I know that previously President Stonecipher, I believe, had asked for an update on what the city was doing with regards to responsible gun ownership, and it was in response to the mass shooting concerns. Was this considered the update? Just to clarify, is this the same, or is this different?
I mean, I think we have heard what we can do about guns. We're preempted by state law from doing anything more stringent than what the state's doing.
Okay, so this is,
what I
there's
heard.
not an additional, okay, just wanted to clarify. And with regards to the gang units that you have, COIT has alternative members of it, and you had spoken about your collaboration and that you, with the FBI providing, an agent and victim support services. Are there any other sort of alternative bodies, people, careers associated with your gang unit that helps with that arena of crime and clientele that you're dealing with there?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we first stood up the unit, the direction was that we would have a prevention and intervention component there. And so we do have what we call a billet. We've got a position assigned to the gang response unit that is a prevention, assigned solely to prevention and intervention. It's not filled right now. That is a commissioned officer position right now. And we've had a couple different officers since we've had the team up and running, including the sergeant of the unit now, who focused on prevention and intervention. So we do have that component. It's not a non-law enforcement component at this point, and unfortunately, just due to staffing, it's not filled. But we're still, the sergeant, because of his experience as the prevention and intervention officer, is still working with some outside organizations that we partner with on intervention and prevention services, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Okay, so that element is missing just because of staffing?
Correct.
Not funding or other things, okay. And you had mentioned about the prosecutors and coordinating with the offices, and that was good news to my ears. I think I had previously, just as a community advocate, heard that there had been some disconnect. You can correct me if I'm wrong about kind of the process going forward. So that's really interesting that it sounds like you have such good coordination now with some of the prosecuting office. With the unlawful possession being assigned to an investigator and having all cases go to one prosecutor, is that enough staff? Do they have enough capacity to manage that?
Obviously not, I don't work there, but in talking with the team that does work there, the answer to that would be no. That they need additional staffing to help deal with the volume of cases that are coming through that are related to violent crime. And I will say this too, that a lot of these developments in terms of some of the collaboration that has occurred in the last few months, as we've started to really try to bring in other stakeholders and really look at where we think we may be having challenges within the system. And so while it's not perfect, and I think that they could always use additional staffing there to help deal with these violent crimes, that it has definitely helped. And even their willingness, the county prosecutors' willingness to dedicate prosecutors to our regional team that we just stood up was significant. just in that effort there. So I think we still have ways to go, but we're on the right track.
And the mayors and I are also meeting with the prosecutor's office.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. Well, let's see. I think I had just one other comment. I am thrilled to hear about the hosting of the event for the gift cards, gun buyback kind of situation. That is amazing, and I'm really looking forward to it and seeing how, you know, we can help publicize that as much as possible. So, kudos. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Zarlingo.
Well, Chief Templeman, that wasn't too lengthy of a presentation. This was very information dense. I thought it was well organized, and you answered so many of my questions here that I'll take a moment or two as I go through this to bypass a bunch that you've already answered. In terms of the police facilities, schedule predictability, freedom for the officers to take their earned vacations, and other dissatisfiers. I mean, part of that I know was limited by staffing. How are we doing otherwise with respect to things like the facilities and the schedule predictability, the kind of things that make it a good or less good place to work compared to others?
That's a work in progress. You know, you're talking about issues that have come to the forefront when it comes to employee satisfaction and officer satisfaction. And I'll be honest with you, you know, when it comes to schedule predictability and being able to get time off, I wish I could say we're doing better, but we're not. You know, with 57 holes out of 215 commissioned positions, and the need for us to have officers out here responding to calls for service, I'll be honest, our officers are probably not getting the amount of time off that I would love to see them get. But they're stepping up and they're doing an amazing job. And so, you know, what I'm excited about, council member, is that by next month and into early October, we're going to have 13 officers in field training. That's a whole platoon. Mm-hmm. We've never had that many in field training at one time. And so, you know, that by the end of the year, maybe we're going to be in a better position, start seeing a better position to where officers will have more opportunity to get time off, to attend more training, and improve some of the quality of life within the workplace.
And the core driver on that and a number of those things remains staffing levels.
It remains staffing, but I'll be honest with you, we work with the union. I met with union officials today, brainstorming on ways to improve. I know the mayor meets with the union officials as well on how can we, you know, do our part, right? I talked about this, that we need to make Washington State a state where people want to be police officers, but we will do our part to make Everett a city where people want to be police officers, but we may need a little help beyond that.
Yeah, okay, that'd be our focus as well. Yeah, I guess I share the general concern. I've looked at it as the sort of the whole process from offense to accountability, and how the laws would suggest some of that work versus the actual path through the justice system. And I think, as you noted, the folks who are more inclined toward criminal activity share information. They're probably aware ahead of most of our population of what things they can't be arrested for or what kind of limits are out there. And I am concerned about that, because I would hate for it to be a situation as our community members learn about it, that they're disappointed that way. And I guess like you, I'm been more focusing as I looked at this on the larger issues, because policing is a piece of this. Well, let me do one of the questions that I had that have been getting some specific questions about, complaints and concerns about motorhomes and other vehicles on the streets for long periods. And I know there are even controversies about chalking tires. And one vehicle I spotted close to our place didn't seem derelict, but had no valid tabs or even license plates. So are we hanging back some from taking action on some of these vehicles because they might be affected by the Supreme Court's Homestead ruling? And do we have, or do we need a process to determine the bounds of that response So in terms of the process, are these homesteads or not? Is it an owner or not? And then lastly, I guess I'd heard in the past from a county official there were financial and other problems with towing motorhomes and disposing of them and getting back the costs. So from that standpoint, that kind of pointed thing about vehicles and especially motorhomes and things, can you give me a sense of where we're at there?
Wow. Yes, I actually can. So let's start with the impact of the state Supreme Court homestead ruling, or that actually wasn't state Supreme Court. That was, I think the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear that case. The answer to that is yes. I mean, we definitely had to adjust how we were treating vehicles that were non-operational maybe, that people were living in, and it was their homes. And we, you know, it's not because we wanted to, it's because the law now required that we treat it differently. And so those complaints that come in do take time, but we still respond to them. But we have now a process, right? And that process involves our co-ed team coming out and an embedded social worker coming out and offering them services, and then coming back and offering them services again. But we still get to the point where we can impound, and we have impounded vehicles, you know, in those circumstances that have become issues and are in violation of our parking laws. So it still does occur. There are expenses involved. We have a process and a system in place with our department and with a certain tow company where we can process those. So homestead, yes, did affect it. Does not mean we still can't enforce. But I will say that, and you know, and this gentleman here, you know, brought forward earlier in the meeting, you know, his concern about you know, vehicles in his neighborhood as well. There are individuals, and this is a perfect example of it, that where they do know the law very well, and so they are, you know, maintaining compliance within the law, but yet still having an impact on the neighborhoods. And so, you know, if somebody moves their vehicle every 72 hours through an intersection, then we start all over again. And so, you know, is that something we want to address, or you as a legislative body want to address at some point? Maybe. But we continue to take enforcement when we can.
Okay, I'm less concerned about just plain people living in vehicles, and I know there are some tools available because the homestead provisions, I think, apply to owners of vehicles, not anybody who happens to be living there, not everybody who happens to be living there. More concerned about some areas, thankfully, I think not ones that I know of here, although I've heard some rumors about other illegal activities going with congregations of these motorhomes or other vehicles, chop shops, bike chop shops, collections of catalytic converters, vehicle chops, or thefts. So I guess I'm keeping an eye out toward that, and that's why I want to know about action on it. And I'm happy to hear your comment about quality of life crimes, because that term can lead people to think we don't take it seriously. But if you've had a theft, a trespass, someone coming into your house or into your yard, or waking up in the morning, somebody banging on your windows, that's quality of life is a pretty faded term to apply to that. Let's see. Well, I'm thinking again about the idea of the path from offense to arrest to accountability. In particular, I guess I'm trying to draw a point with us as a legislative body. You know, we're accountable for that too, and we need to make sure that more links work, that the path is one that's got integrity, that there's not such leakage from it. And I'm hearing a lot about those various forms of leakage where there are things that go too long past statute of limitations. There aren't investigators, there aren't enough prosecutors, there aren't enough judges. And I can imagine one of the prime dissatisfiers of an officer or a detective would be finding evidence and charging somebody, but having it disappear somewhere for one reason or another. And I guess I do see that as our responsibility. And that isn't just prosecution. You know, sometimes that's diversion or treatment or rehabilitation. But that system works if those pieces all are working together. And I guess that I come back again and again to the budgets and priorities, the resources available to it. I think that's the core thing. And I guess I've been informed recently by a couple of things in particular. There was an Atlantic article that was subtitled, "When the Speed of Repercussions Drops, Society Loses a Key Deterrent Against Unlawful Behavior." And the first people to know that are the people who probably need those deterrents the most. The late Mark Kleiman, a policy professor and a consultant to the state of Washington, summarized the necessity for justice to be, as he said, he didn't invent this term, swift, certain, and fair. And I think that we're failing in pieces of all of that, not you, not your department. That's all of us. And that's why I guess I'll be looking in particular resources from investigators, prosecutors, judges, and probation officers as well, really the whole chain that I think you had mentioned earlier. So thank you for that. Thank you for the extra perspective, and don't hesitate to hammer on us when we need to be doing our job more.
Thank you.
Councilmember Vogely.
I shall also keep this brief. I was speaking with a data analyst recently, and I just wanted to share that they believe you are doing an awesome job at delivering data to, well, with our open public, not open public meetings, the open data.
Open data portal.
Yeah, you're amazing, and you do more than like anybody in the state, was their opinion. So kudos, plain and simple. And AR could be automatic rifle, but I'd rather it be the response, but what's the A part of it? Alternative response. Let's get that going. That's the new AR in this world. And for real, thank you for all that information. And I do believe that y'all are doing a good job, and I appreciate it. And there's much to be done. Thank you.
You're welcome. And we are, just so that everybody knows, we're still working on more data transparency. I wish I could take all the credit for that. IT has been a huge driver of that, and Stephen Hellier and his whole team. But we are working on some other data transparency projects that I think will be pretty interesting to the community in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know all of the terms, but this person did, and she was highly impressed.
Great, thank you.
Vice President Tui.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Chief, for being here tonight. I knew that this needed to be brought forward to the whole council. It's just that important, and your analysis and yet the challenges that you guys face every day is real, and I think we all really respect your team and thank you for all your hard work. So as we move forward, as we can help as we can, I know I certainly would support initiatives that you feel are necessary. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Councilmember Ryan.
Thank you so much, Chief, for being here tonight for your thorough presentation. I had a couple questions first about just clarifying some of the data points. So on the charts and graphs, are those all individual incidents that are recorded? And if so, what do you think the percentage or how are repeat offenders captured in those total number of incidences?
So yes, they are individual incidences, or what my analysts would say offenses, depending on which graph we're looking at. And I don't have that data available to me in terms of, out of that number of, let's say, 1,600 violent crimes, how many of those, some of them don't have suspects, right? But we still take reports on them, so it's still going to count. So, we could certainly probably, pull information on that, but I don't know how accurate it would be in terms of really telling us a story, because so many of them, right? If they're, like we had one the other day where somebody was assaulted with a rock, and, well, that one we made the arrest on, but we have some where they run away, and we don't even know who did it. Now, was that somebody with previous history? We don't know. So, but I don't have that specific data point available to me tonight.
No worries, just curious. And then do domestic violence offenses fall under crimes against persons?
Yes.
Okay. I remember my day job in 2020, their domestic violence services of Snohomish County shared that their numbers were actually really low in 2020 because when folks were staying home, it wasn't always a safe place for folks or for people experiencing domestic violence to report because their abuser was also home with them. So wanted to pass that along for the numbers and whatnot. Let's see. Yeah, you're correct. I do hear often from, especially in my district, I have a lot of Broadway, 41st, Evergreen, but property owners who are concerned about property crimes against their business and trash that's left behind and graffiti and paraphernalia that they might find. What are some messages that I can share with them and pass along to them?
Yeah, I think that what I can say, is that for individuals or businesses that are victimized in that manner, we still want to know about those crimes, because every month we do have leadership team meetings where we call them ESTAT meetings, Everett CompStat meetings, where all of our department leadership and then some come together and we look at crime data. So there are opportunities, sometimes businesses don't report. So even if it's online reporting of a, graffiti or a broken window or something, we need those to be reported so that we, even if we don't have a suspect, even if we're not going to be able to follow up. Now, I will say this too, that when we do have suspect information, sometimes it takes a long time because our property crimes unit is depleted in terms of staffing, but we still are investigating cases where we do have suspect leads. And again, it may take some time, and we've seen some success, especially with some prolific burglars and property crime offenders. And some of those have been highlighted in the media, even out in Silver Lake area and then up here in your district, up along 41st and in the downtown area, somebody who'd committed 18 burglaries, and we were able to track those individuals down. So continue to report, the garbage, I know that along public right-of-ways, and I know Ryan's here today too, we've got the cleanup crew that can help with some of that, along public right-of-way. So if it's in front of a business on a sidewalk or whatnot, there's some opportunities there. And then, and again, this isn't, a solution in all cases, right? But lighting, looking at your property and creating an environment where people can't hide and do things, in the dark, under the cover of darkness. It's not always effective, because sometimes with some of this population, it doesn't matter. They can see a camera and they'll do whatever beneath it. But there are some, where that is effective. So those would be some of the pieces of advice I would give to some of the business owners out there.
Great, thank you. And I think one of the things missing from the presentation was an overview of the work that you've been doing, particularly for de-escalation training and equitable police practices. So I was hoping you could briefly touch on that, because I know that's a whole nother 40-minute presentation. Yeah. But if you could share more about the work that you've been doing and how long you've been doing it.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. We've been mandating de-escalation training for our officers and crisis intervention training since about 2016, so before it really became a mandate at the state level. And our requirement here in Everett is 40 hours per officer, and I know that we've got a lot of new officers, and so we're running 3 new classes here in, I think, September, October, November, to get a lot of our newest officers through this 40-hour block. The lieutenant behind us has been involved in training. He's been involved in the I-940, Initiative 940, patrol tactics, race and policing training. So we have 4 or 5 instructors in that. We've gotten our entire department through. We were not required to get us through this training until 2028, and our entire department went through it last year. We train on implicit bias, we train on procedural justice, and right now we're working on a new program in our training unit to partner with either a institution of higher education or a contractor that works in race issues in policing and whatnot, to put together an internal program for all of our internal officers, and maybe even deliver that countywide to law enforcement countywide. So we continue to try to be on the forefront of that type of training and realize the value it brings to our agency and to the community.
Appreciate that, thank you. Are there plans to do another CatCon coming up? I know they've been tremendously successful with huge long wait lines, and I was also wondering if there could be a consideration to do a similar bike registration event.
Project CatCon, which is the engraving projects that we've been doing. Right now, we don't have anything scheduled, but as we start heading into fall, the last project we partnered with Snow Isle, and so they've been out of school for the last couple months. So as we start heading back into fall, it's certainly something that we can look at, and in terms of bicycle registration, if there's a program out there. I mean, we're always interested in looking at, new and programs that may help minimize people being victims, or at least allow us a little bit of the opportunity to track stolen property and return it to its rightful owner. So we could certainly look at something like that.
Thanks. You mentioned that officers, if they encounter somebody using drugs and they offer services 3 times, then they can take additional actions. What are some of the barriers to, besides the obvious administrative barriers to recording the incidences, what are the barriers to getting those 3 incidences recorded?
Well, the barriers typically, right, are, for an officer, they're going to need to take the time to write a report and collect evidence, in a case where there's really there's no enforcement action. So that is a barrier. That's something that I think officers consider. I think call load is a barrier. I think that the officers, when they have 25 calls holding, on the screen, that going out and dealing with somebody that, may have drugs on them or may not, is a barrier, because they want to get to the next call, and they know that if I've got to stop and write a report and impound evidence, it's going to take them out of service for an hour. And then I also believe that, officers that don't witness, so maybe a resident in your district witnesses somebody smoking drugs, and by the time we get there, they're not. We can't, that's not an exception to the misdemeanor presence rule. So we don't have the authority, to take enforcement action in a situation like that. So there are a few different barriers. The database stuff is a little bit of a barrier because it's a little clunky, and it's not always effective. And if officers in Linwood, and I'm not saying that Linwood does this, but I'm using that as an example, aren't making referrals, then they're not going to be in the system, for us to then be able to take action.
Okay, thanks. I'm really thrilled about all of the new ARs, alternative responses, listed, and I think these numbers are a lot to be proud of. And, I wish they were all double, of course, but just out of curiosity and to put an underscore point that I'd like to make, of the 35 folks placed in pallet shelters, how many were rearrested later? Or how many were justice involved again later?
Yeah, that I don't know, but I can tell you that our police response to the pallet shelter site is fairly minimal. So unless they're committing crime somewhere else and being rearrested somewhere else, I would say that number is probably fairly low, but I don't have specific data on that.
Great. I think that's all I have for questions. Thanks. I did want to also underscore the slide mentioning challenges talking about lack of treatment, detox, and housing. The folks that I know that work with people experiencing substance use disorder share that if they get a call that somebody's ready for treatment, the barriers to get them into treatment anywhere nearby, there's not a detox center in all of Snohomish County that's easily accessible, is that window of when somebody's ready for treatment is so small. And so to be able to pick them up, drive them to Oak Harbor for detox or down to, or Port Angeles is, if we want to see clean people on the streets, we need to have access to treatment facilities and detox facilities that they can get to. So I'd love to see something in Snohomish County that addresses and supplies detox beds for people. And then in addition to that, continuing with the continuum of care so that they have a warm handoff to housing afterwards, so that they can establish a new way of life and a new community that surrounds them towards a life of stability. So just addressing that entire continuum, I think, would be just so transformative for ensuring that people don't continue to loop back through the system and engage in activities that are detrimental to their livelihood. And tangentially, since you brought up the legislative agenda, Deputy Mayor Harper, I was curious about what the process is to suggest things for the legislative priority list, and just as my newbie question of the night, how does that process work?
Yeah, so we'll be scheduling meetings with you all through September through November, and we can have individual conversations about ideas and issues that you'd like to make sure are included, and, yep,
Great. Make sure your pen's full of ink for my meeting.
absolutely.
All right, great. Thank you again, Chief Templeman. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I don't have very much to add. I want to thank you, Chief, for bringing forward, especially the data. It's really important for our community to see kind of what's going on. And that's just, I know behind every one of those numbers, there's stories and to tell. A couple questions I had. One thing, and this may come out with the police study that we're doing, but when you talk about police reporting and, you know, kind of the process it takes an hour to get one of these reports entered into the system, are there more efficient systems or processes that are used in other communities that we could be, you know, shifting over to, or do we have like the best and the latest systems?
We have the latest system. And, you know, as far as, you know, other communities, you know, this specifically when it comes to, let's say, drugs and some of the barriers that Councilmember Ryan asked about, you know, we're very unique here in Washington with the law that we have. So drawing a comparison, you know, to other communities and do they have a more efficient way of dealing with something like this is challenging, right? Because we may be on a little bit of an island when it comes to that. So I'm not aware of that. I don't know that this specific assessment's going to get that detailed with that specific issue, because it wasn't an issue when we first drafted the RFP and everything for that assessment. It's something that's developed obviously in the last year or so. But we continue to look, and I will be honest with you that while our system is still clunky, I think that the team that has put it together has done a great job of putting something together out of nothing.
Yeah, it's like if a police officer, highly skilled, is spending their time writing a report or, you know, dictating a report or whatever, however that happens, that is a waste of good resource. You'd be better off to have a scribe with you to write things down or something. Anyway, just an observation. I've spent my day in operations, you can tell. And then a couple of things, you know, for me, I think knowing and having been in my life involved with several people who were suffering from substance abuse disorders, one thing that I find kind of unfortunate about the changes in the laws is that I've known a lot of people, family members and friends, who an arrest has been sort of the triggering event that caused them to go through treatment. And I'm not sure that, you know, without that care or that stick, you know, the judge saying you will do an inpatient treatment stint, I'm not sure that they would have made those choices, or maybe not at the time that they did, or maybe never. And so we're losing that opportunity. I don't know how to replace that, but I think that there's some truth to the idea that you have to sort of hit your personal, you know, rock bottom before you come out from that. A lot of times when you're suffering from some kind of addictive personality. So I just don't know what to make of that. Supposedly, if we were able to change the law in a way that, you know, maybe, I don't know if there's even a way to mitigate, you know, the rebound effect of just kind of arresting people, getting them in jail and getting them involved in the legal system so much. But there is, I think, some value to someone getting an arrest that sort of wakes them up and makes them get the treatment and the help that they need.
I'll just say I completely agree with that, and from talking to our officers that work with this population, and I've even heard it from people that are in recovery, that it was the arrest that was that event that really triggered. Now, that's not the case with everybody.
No.
But certainly there is a segment of our population out there where that is the most effective means. And so I too would love to see that tool back in our toolbox at some point.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Have we eliminated some of the non-urgent calls? I mean, I know, you know, I can remember a year ago or so, we changed the false alarm fees so that people would kind of take care of their alarm systems, because obviously that's a big waste of police time. Have we, for example, stopped responding to property crimes where the crime is not in process any longer, or are we using different resources to respond to those? Or, I mean, I know I've been aware in Seattle, like if that happens, they give you the website and you go on and put your information there, and they'll give you a case number. You call your insurance company and tell them what was stolen out of your car, and that's it.
No. But maybe this is the beginning of public education, that this is the road we're going down. Because the reality of it is that we are right now looking at, not just with Everett, but regionally, looking at increasing the number of crimes and the types of crimes that we can offer online reporting to. But I will be honest with you, and you get these all, and I get them every day. You know, it took an officer 2 hours to get to my vehicle prowl. And it's a complaint into you, into the council member, into the mayor's office. It comes to us. We have to look into it. We have to explain why it took us 2 hours to get to this vehicle prowl. You know, our community is going to have to accept that we're just in a different time, and you may not get a police officer at all, right? I just think how many complaints we get today because it took 2 hours for an officer. Imagine if we didn't even respond at all. But that's where we're going, right? That's where we have to go.
You have to,
And so we will continue to look at that. Right now, the first step is increasing our online reporting options.
Yeah.
And then really looking at,
Build
and
that in.
hopefully part of the assessment will also dig into that.
Yeah. My guess is that if there's no expectation that a police officer is even going to show up, that you might not find as many complaints because they didn't wait 2 hours. They aren't waiting at all. They were able to go online and do the only thing that was available to them. So that might be helpful. And then I know, Chief, we've talked about this in the past about gang, and you know, the research that I did, you know, related to city council work around gang activity, really pointed to the fact that gang activity is in most respects an economic decision. People who join gangs, especially when they're kids, are making a decision. That gang gives them, you know, money for doing their dirty work. And we've talked about, you know, thinking about how we could respond in, like, there've been other communities where they simply pay kids an allowance of cash for every week that they stay out of a gang, and it's kind of managed through social service agencies or the school district, or and I know we've talked about that. There was some gift card things that, but you know, I recognize this is just a huge burden of staffing to try to manage this. But I wonder if there isn't an opportunity for us to even ask for proposals from the community, and maybe the city would fund some of this work, you know, through grants or whatever, through some of our funding, to develop some of these unique programs that I think could be helpful in minimizing gang activity. Obviously, there's probably a whole cadre of gang members that we're not going to pay enough. You know, you can't pay them $60,000 a year. But I think there could be a prevention measure for some younger kids to kind of minimize the number that really get involved in this activity, because it does become a lifetime sort of service to the gang.
And we did, you know, back in 2017 when we launched the mayor's directive to address this issue, we did, you know, prevention intervention was a big component. We did launch a couple campaigns, Pathways for Adolescent Youth and Pivot. And what the team found was that having law enforcement managing and overseeing those programs stifled involvement in those programs. And so what you see in King County and Pierce County are nonprofits and other organizations, community organizations that are stepping up, and they're getting involved, and they're applying for the grants, and they're creating these programs, and they're seeing, you know, although King County and Pierce County are still having significant challenges, but they also have some success stories there. So I agree with you. I would certainly love to see community organizations step up and say, hey, we'd love to start a program here, and have law enforcement maybe be a support component of that.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, no action on that, but I think that might be worth talking to some of those organizations that are doing that, just to say, hey, would you expand into our community? That's all, and I am glad to hear about I knew we did the de-escalation. I wasn't aware of the equitable policing practices work that we're doing with our training, so I think that's great to hear. appreciate that very much. Any other final comments?
One quick one, I guess. My sense is that in terms of moving in a direction where some things would not get an officer, property crimes, that sort of stuff, that you would rather have the resources to make sure that there was an officer responding in a time that was satisfactory.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But it may be a combination of both, because I'll be honest with you, some of the calls that we're responding to today are so much more complex than they were when I was out in patrol. It takes more officers. If you're going to really do de-escalation and you're going to follow state law that says having more than one officer on scene and, you know, trying to de-escalate situations, we're pulling, you know, it takes more officers and it takes us longer. We're spending much more time on these calls de-escalating. So yes, more officers, absolutely, but we still may need to look at managing our call response as well. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of our agenda. With no further business and no executive session, we are now adjourned.